Good afternoon, and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. Today is the last in our webinar series, The Fierce Urgency of Now. Over the course of this semester, we've had the privilege and pleasure to host a wide range of scholars, activists, practitioners from across the United States and across the world, working on a range of issues at the intersection of economic justice and racial justice. Today, our final session for the series, we're delighted to welcome Megan Francis, who's a fellow at the Carr Center and a highly accomplished scholar. But before I introduce Megan, I want to just flag a couple of things for our audience's consideration so that you can continue to follow the activities and work of the Carr Center. You can follow us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website. You can listen to our podcast, Justice Matters, which is available on Spotify, iTunes, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. We have a recent interview with Megan on the Justice Matters podcast, as well as one very recently with Mathias, Risse, our faculty director. And finally, you should check out our annual report, which is on the website, which captures all of the work and the amazing people at the center. So turning now to introduce Megan. Megan is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and was previously a visiting associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's the founding co-director of the Race and Capitalism Project and a former research fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She specializes in the study of American politics with broad interest in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. At the Carr Center, she's going to be working on her next book, which is focused on how to fund a movement, which examines the history and future of philanthropy's complicated relationship with social movements. So thank you so much for joining us, Megan. I'm going to turn it over to her now, after which you'll hear questions from both Mathias, Risse, and myself. And we welcome questions from our audience as well, which you can post in the chat box. Thank you. Over to you, Megan.
Great, everyone. So hello from Seattle, Washington. It's really great to be here with you guys all. It is good morning from Seattle. I know that it's good afternoon for those who are on the East Coast. I really want to express my deep appreciation to the Carr Center for organizing, from what I understand, is this incredible speaker series today. And I'm just so excited to end it with you guys all today on such an important topic. So I'm going to be talking about social movements, and not just in terms of kind of the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement or the movement for Black lives, but I'm going to be talking about the longer history of that. So I also, kind of before I go into my talk today, really want to acknowledge the anxiety of the moment here. This year has showed us who we are as a nation in so many different ways. It strikes me that, especially in doing so much kind of thinking about and reflection of this year, that the thing that people have been running from the most is violence. More precisely, the structuring role of violence in American society. So we are a nation, I think it's been revealed by many people, and I think it's quite clear that we are a nation with a massively unequal healthcare system, a racist and violent police force, millions of Americans who teeter on the edge of food and housing security, and rising levels of authoritarianism. Every month, week, and now day brings new horrors and new surprises. COVID outbreaks in schools, increasing homelessness, voter disenfranchisement. It has gotten so bad that to cope, many people had kind of say, throw the entire 2020 away. And I get it, right? It's not just untenable. It has been for many people soul crushing and violent. So 2020 has been all of those things. And yet, the events of this year have showed us that another world is possible. People have come together in ways that I couldn't even have imagined just 1 year ago, and mutual aid for their communities, our public health professionals risking their lives to save ours, in solidarity in the form of righteous indignation and marches against institutional racism. Together, people across this nation, poor and wealthy, non-citizen and citizen, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and white, have started to build a new world. The present may not be the world we want, but it's clear that a lot of people have an incredible amount of fight left in them. The problems that we see today, though, I think it's important. This is something that I always underline whenever I talk to people. The problems that we see today did not begin with COVID-19, nor did they begin in May with the murder of George Floyd, and they didn't even begin with Trump. And so let me say this a bit more explicitly. All the problems that have been laid bare quite explicitly in 2020 were around before 2020. It's just that many people chose not to see them. We are a nation that has been running from its history and its present. Every time a politician said something like, "This is not who we are," a chorus of people, mostly people of color, shouted back, "This is always who we were." The great African-American sociologist W.B. Du Bois tells us that, quote, "A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect," end quote. The system as it currently operates does not provide justice and safety, nor does it treat people equally, because it was never meant to. The ugly reality of who we are has been laid bare, and who we are is this. A nation that has many problems, and yet still a nation in which many of its citizens and people who are here, who are non-citizens, have risen up and demanded something different. Many people have said, in looking at the pandemic, that COVID-19 has affected all of us and significantly changed our way of life. And there was this unique moment, I think, and I think it seems so far away now, but in March and April of national anxiety and collective suffering, when it seemed that the virus could infect and kill any of us. Tom Hanks got it. Remember, that was supposed to be a moment to show us, right, that the virus does not discriminate. But then April came and went, and collectively we watched something else. COVID ripped through and ravaged Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. The loss of life has been staggering, as we know. In Minnesota, the results 1 week after the murder of George Floyd revealed that Black Americans accounted for 6% of the population, but 14% of the COVID-19 cases and 33% of COVID-19 deaths. In New Orleans, in which there's been a lot of focus, Black residents accounted for a harrowing 77% of COVID-19 deaths. This was a stat at the end of June. The COVID-19 tracking project is a great place for those interested in following the race and ethnicity data around COVID-19 infection and death rates. Overall, the COVID-19 tracking project details that nationwide, Black people are dying at 2.3 times the rate of white people. All right, on that, I'm gonna share my slides here. So bear with me, everyone. I'm not the singer, so let's go, okay. All right, 1 second. This is like, by the way, as most advanced I'm gonna get. Do you see this actually moving on the screen? Okay, we're gonna move past this now. 1 second here. Okay. So this data that you see on your screen right now is from the COVID-19 tracking project about revealing some of the interesting, I think, and also horrifying statistics. 1 second here. Okay. So the statistics that so many of us have followed revealed an ugly truth, right? That COVID-19, the virus, does not discriminate, but structural racism has created the conditions through which certain communities will be disproportionately impacted. And what I mean by this is that persisting health disparities impact access to adequate health care, impact the quality of health care, right? Impact the delivery of services, but also, and perhaps most importantly, impact the underlying environmental conditions that make one more or less susceptible to illness. Black and Latinx people are more likely to live, for example, near waste sites and thus be exposed to toxins and pollutants. A disproportionate number of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities do not have drinkable water and have higher rates of asthma, diabetes, and cancer. Racism is, as this is, I think, a really interesting article, which I'm happy to drop in the chat. Racism is, as a team of researchers has described in a recent article, quote, a fundamental cause of disease and the strange but familiar root of racial health disparities. COVID-19 didn't just reveal deep health disparities, it stopped people from running from the truth, literally. So, right, I'm an academic, and so sometimes we have theories, sometimes they're verifiable, sometimes they're not. But anyways, so I have an unproven theory that part of the reason the Black Lives Matter protest felt different this time It's because people couldn't run. White people in this country have always wanted to run from the truth about their culpability and complicity in upholding racist and oftentimes violent structures. That this country is racist is absolutely not new. It's not even new to conservatives. But racism has often seemed so overwhelming that well-intentioned people have acknowledged it, but done nothing to fix it. Because there is no time, this is something that many of you guys have probably heard, that there is no time and there is so many other things to do. But this time, right, this time in 2020, there was nowhere to go, nowhere to escape to, because COVID made it so that places of refuge, of shelter were closed. There were no recitals, right, no long champagne brunches. Most office places were closed. The performing arts were shut down. It was you at home with your screens and all of the news, and nowhere to go but to face the ugly truth of being a citizen or living in a nation where law enforcement can murder innocent Black people because of the color of their skin. And the victim's last words caught on video because the killing happened in broad daylight. Let's see. The murder of George Floyd was not the first time that an innocent Black person has been killed by police. Of course, many of us now know this. There was Breonna Taylor in March, Stephon Clark, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile pulled over for a traffic stop in 2016, Alton Sterling for selling CDs and DVDs in Louisiana, and of course, Eric Garner in 2014, who died in a chokehold while saying, "I can't breathe," 11 times, and so many more. The most recent data collected by the organization Mapping Police Violence, that is, these are some screenshots that you see on your screen right now, reveals that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. There is a crisis of enormous proportions in the areas of policing and incarceration in the United States. The history of racialized policing in this country is long. I'm happy to get into more of this in the Q&A later on. But I will say just for now, because there's a lot more that I want to get to before the Q&A, is that in my research and in so many other people's research, especially if we think about like the end of enslavement and after the period of Reconstruction, what so many Southern states do is they then pass all these new criminal laws, practice a system of racialized policing, and then what you see all across in many of the Southern states is these increasing incarcerated populations made up of majority Black people, right? So thinking about kind of the racist roots of criminal laws as well as policing. So meditate on this, for a moment. A group of Americans encounter a vastly different police force than others and pay the ultimate price through death. Not just in 2020. This is really important for me to say, right? That where we are right now is not incredibly new, but over the long durée of American history. Black people have shown that racism is deadly for generations. And it was not until a global health pandemic pushed everyone indoors and shut down all the activities that we normally participate in, that a much wider population of Americans came to learn more, were outraged, and committed themselves to making change. So I may be critical about how long it took a majority of Americans to actually get here, but I'm also thankful that many have arrived. My point in starting off with an articulation of this problem is not to overwhelm you, but it is not to say that these structures developed centuries ago and weaponized in the present are impossible to transform. Understanding the deep-rooted circumstances that have led us to the current predicament is crucial to understanding the significant social change significant social change takes a long time. So I do hope that in describing the problem, that it's useful in setting expectations about our timeline to transform structures. I'm also going to say, as an aside, this is not in my notes for today, but one of the things that just drives me insane is after 2014, after 2015 BLM protests, when people used to say, what did the protest accomplish? Where is the change? And I'm always like, part of the problem is that question is actually the incorrect question, right? That means that you actually don't understand how entrenched the problem of racial violence is in this country, and it would never be gone in a year. All right, so I have good news and bad news. The good news is that the battle for the soul, that in this battle and these kind of the so many protests that we have seen, is that there's another chapter that people have dreamt, organized into movements, and fought back. The BLM protests during the spring and summer of 2020 have literally brought this nation to its knees. For millions of Americans, the protests have come as a surprise, historic protest in this country. The current transformative moment, however, is built on the legacies and work of previous Black protest movements. We don't get a BLM 2020 protest without the protests after the Zimmerman acquittal for killing Trayvon Martin in 2012, or the Ferguson uprising in 2014, or the Baltimore BLM protest as well. But it goes back even further than the 21st century establishment of the movement for Black lives. The long Black freedom movement developed the political language, strategizing, and organizing infrastructure that has culminated in the present moment. Examining this longer lineage of Black protest movements is critical in helping all of us understand how we arrived here today and the urgent need to move forward with boldness in the future. All right, but first, before I kind of get to that, I really want to spend a little bit of time in thinking about what has, in some ways, hindered our imagination of rights making, or constrained how we might perhaps view the Black Lives Matter movement. All right, I'm not going to do that. So there's a reason why I'm throwing up some movie posters here. This is going to make sense in a moment, I promise. So civil rights history is interesting to me. It's my jam. My entire career has been spent on, or in terms of focus on the arc of civil rights, of telling stories that we think we know well, but in different ways. And in our national reckoning of civil rights, I find it so unsettling the way that civil rights is imagined, packaged, and oftentimes sold to the American public. American democratic exceptionalism, for the most part, cannot make sense of the persisting violence endured by Black citizens throughout the entirety of this nation's existence. Instead, many scholars have practiced what I think is a form of scholarly violence in the form of erasure, whereby the specter of anti-Black violence emerges in the 1950s and civil rights guarantees of the 1960s become vindication that liberalism is still possible and that Black lives can matter inside of American democracy. The civil rights movement, as far as most are concerned, began in 1954, culminates with a large-scale protest, and then ends in dramatic fashion in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. The story begins with little Black kids being allowed to attend school with little white kids through the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision. It then gained speed with the Freedom Rides, the lunch counter sit-ins, and the March on Washington. Individuals like Martin Luther King, and even sometimes Rosa Parks, and especially nonviolent demonstrators, are the heroes of the story. And then it reaches its peak with the Civil Rights Act of '64. There are recognizable names, very few of which are women. Men are at the center. People like Coretta Scott King keep house, and powerful figures such as Ella Baker and Diane Nash are relegated to the sidelines. The villains are people like Bull Connor, an explicit segregationist, not well-meaning white clergy, or perhaps even white philanthropists. Yes, of course, I went there. It is the civil rights story. It is our civil rights story. It tells us that confronted with grave injustices, America changes. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, or so they like to say. This narrative is everywhere. If we look at the Hollywood films that have funded over the last few years, there is slavery, right? And then there's civil rights activism in the 60s, and then there's Obama's success. Like, what? Huh? Like, where's all the in between, right? Where's the different, more complicated, complex stories? All right. So my problem, I think, perhaps with this story, well, there's a lot of problems, many of which I'm not going to get into today, but I think it is incomplete. The problem with this triumphant story is that it overlooks the decades upon decades of suffering and struggle, and the very long and complicated and not short and compact story of racial change in this country. It tells us that there was one way that change happened, nonviolent direct action, through appealing to the moral conscience of Americans, and that change is swift, and that America ultimately will align her institutions with her cherished ideals if people just stand up and fight. My worry with this story is that it props up one narrow vision of rights making and blinds us to the very long process of change into the range of different strategies. This traditional, dare I say, romantic narrative of civil rights misunderstands the focus of the movement. Jim Crow wasn't really about or focused on lunch counters and water fountains. It was a system that focused on Black death and violence by the state and private individuals. And the dominant focus on education in some ways has hidden the violence of racism. Right? This is, to me, in terms of the picture that you see on your screen, a very violent picture in so many ways. In many ways, the sanitized history has been weaponized against people and groups in the present movement who are pushing for more and utilizing a different set of strategies. This narrative has been deployed in an attempt to help this nation to heal, but you can't heal if you don't tell the full truth. All right, so I'm going to focus on two different moments or figures that I think are truly important to understand the longer history now of the movement for Black lives and social movements that have focused on making Black lives matter. So in general, the American public knows very little about the long tradition of the Black Lives Matter protests. And it is my belief that the long history of the BLM movement can teach us all something important about the durability of white supremacy, how to hold institutions accountable, and how to fight for justice using the tools that we already have. Throughout Reconstruction, and especially afterwards, African Americans faced a regime of racial terror. Frustrated by the promises of the Reconstruction amendments, many whites banded together and used lynchings and mob violence to enforce the post-emancipation racial order that protected white supremacy. The Equal Justice Initiative has collected the most comprehensive data, reported the grim finding that between 1877 and 1950, there have been over 4,000 African-American lynching victims. The killing of Black people and the absence of consequences for white perpetrators was the most effective way to undermine the promises of emancipation. In 1900, the civil rights icon, Ida B. Wells, spoke at a gathering in Chicago and delivered a stinging indictment, quote, "Our country's national crime is lynching," end quote. Wells would know best. She was the first person to investigate lynchings, collect data on Black death, and then highlight the injustice of lynching and the loss of Black life through her incredible journalism work. Wells revealed that lynchings of Black people were intricately linked to the protection of white economic power. It was an unofficial tool of the state to push back Black economic advancement. The linking of anti-Black violence to the system of capitalism is a central relationship that Black radical activists would take up and place at the center of their visions of liberation in the 1960s and the 1970s, and especially now in the movement for Black lives. Wells' work highlights the importance of the process of knowledge production, the need for freedom fighters to collect data and write their own stories. When Wells began her activism, the protection of Black lives from lynching and mob violence was not considered a civil rights issue, nor was it a mobilizing cause for Black people. Wells' investigations and writings about lynchings dramatically shifted the frame of how to understand the violent spectacle. Wells named the unjust violence and called it out for being a tool of white supremacy, thereby providing the political language for Black people to articulate the harm they endured and the responsibility of the government to remedy it. Finally, it is Wells who effectively situated lynchings at the crux of American democracy. In order to protect voting, education, and workplace rights of Black people, the senseless killings of Black people had to stop. The protection of Black lives was the first civil right. Influenced by her activism, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People at NAACP was formed in 1909 and led the largest mass movement of people in history against lynching and mob violence. This flag you see, a man was lynched yesterday. I know it's been in circulation a lot, especially around Black Lives Matter protests. It was a flag that the NAACP hung outside of their offices in New York City once they got word from any of their contacts that a lynching occurred. And it was just as a reminder to people in the North about how often Black people lost their lives. All right. So before the NAACP, they'll focus, and this is important because I think many people tend to focus and think about the NAACP today. Again, it's the oldest civil rights organization still in existence, but many people tend to associate the NAACP with their work around education, desegregation, as well as their incredible work around voting rights. That is true, but before that, in the first 2 decades in the early 20th century, they were focused on exposing the dangerous levels of racial violence endured by Black people, by police officers, by politicians, and by private white citizens. I chronicle all of this in my first book, Civil Rights in the Making of the Modern American State. The book is trying to make a claim about how Black citizens constructed civil rights in American politics in the darkest of times, before the landmark Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision, at the height of lynchings, abandoned by both national parties, and decades before the student sit-ins and the heyday of civil rights activism. How did the NAACP organize in a political environment that did not treat Black people as full citizens? The NAACP's battle against racial violence is particularly important to understand for what it tells us about the process and time horizons of social justice movements. Many of us have been trained to understand the Black Lives Matter movement through the lens of the traditional civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. But I think, or I want to propose, that that is insufficient. The literature on the success of the civil rights movement emphasizes something that I think is familiar to many of us, called the political opportunity structure. The theory that sympathetic openings in the political or perhaps legal environment are necessary for social movement success, right? That there's an opening here and then a movement will move in this space. Yet there is not a lot of literature that explains why and how Black people organize when there does not appear to be political openings. The NAACP's anti-lynching campaign in the first quarter of the 20th century reveals, I think, the importance of the creation of opportunity and possibility as a first stage of struggle. Opportunities in a violent white supremacist political regime are not organic. They must be created through nimble organizing. The NAACP's anti-lynching organizing displays the importance of building a mass movement of people focused on the protection of Black lives to creating new political and legal openings. So in order to fight this racist violence, the NAACP organized mass demonstrations, lobbied Congress to pass a federal anti-lynching bill, and petitioned 2 different presidents, segregationist Woodrow Wilson, yes, as well as Warren G. Harding, to speak out, and they both did make a statement condemning lynching. Perhaps the most extraordinary achievement was Moore v. Dempsey, a landmark criminal procedure case handed down by the Supreme Court in 1923. And so there was this massive, right, in terms of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, as well as mass organizing in the street. It was a massive, extraordinary, in-your-face campaign that forced America to confront lynching and mob violence of Black people. It asked America, how strong was its commitment to protecting Black lives? As a result of the NAACP's organizing in the first quarter of the 20th century, the rates of lynching and mob violence dramatically decreased. Much research in political science looks to institutions and elite actors in government to explain dramatic shifts in political and constitutional development. The NAACP's movement against racist violence tells a different story. It suggests that bottom-up protests can meaningfully change the actions taken by political institutions and make government more accountable to citizens. The key takeaway from my research, I think, or I hope, is that protest in conjunction with pressure inside of political and legal institutions is necessary to reduce racial violence, as well as the importance of mass movements to creating a whole new field of opportunities and possibilities. Historically, Black protest has served as a kind of testimony to the nation's most vulnerable and its ability to expose the bankruptcy of a country that has failed repeatedly at offering equal justice and equality for all of its citizens. So I know that I'm almost at time, so I'm going to skip a little bit ahead in what I want. I'm going to close down this slideshow and then speak for, if that's okay, probably about another 3 minutes. And then I'm going to close. So I'm going to stop the share here. And where's my screen here? Hello, everyone. How are you guys doing again? All right. So I want to just in terms of just to move a little bit more. So Ida B. Wells knew, the NAACP knew, Martin Luther King knew, today's courageous Black Lives Matter protesters know. The system as it currently exists is not made to protect Black lives. And the only way we will survive is if we organize and create the conditions where we can live. The purpose of past protests, the purpose of the contemporary protests, I think, is to tell a story to the public about the true nature of our society. Black protest movements have historically been about holding a mirror up to this nation and working within and around institutions that have never treated them as full citizens. In doing so, I hope and I think that they have helped this country answer, for me, which is always kind of the question, who do we want to be? But Black protesters cannot do this alone. To expect Black folk to further sacrifice by being the ones responsible for repairing the wrongs of racial injustice is to add another burden to those who are already experiencing loss. The political theorist Julian Hooker argues that the burden of repair of American democracy, of America's racial sins, should not lay on the shoulders of those already enduring injustice. Black protesters can win, but it will take all of us. Concerned people of different races need to take up the struggle for racial justice as their struggle, not charity, but committed struggle. Being in solidarity does not mean just reading a book or a donation. That can definitely be a part of it. It means every day doing the work, using your power and privilege to end your power and privilege. It means making space for a different set of conversations and organizing praxis. It means showing up differently for your community. And there are so many ways, I think, that we can do this. Protesting in the streets is not for everyone, but people do need to show up differently this time. And I think that one of the crucial things moving forwards that will help ensure that we do not come back to this moment is that there is a way, right, throughout the 20th century that in terms of kind of the focus of the movement for Black lives and racial violence has been relegated and pushed to the sidelines, in part because it doesn't map on to our ways that we think perhaps American political and legal institutions should operate. But we really need to center that. Center it now and in the future. And we cannot water down the struggle, right? We cannot say things like defund the police is a problematic, right? And in terms of, I think it perhaps may be more useful to say that so many of these commissions that we have are not useful because it's actual in terms of the facts and proof of the past 2 years, 10 years actually have shown us this. So I will say in terms of just a little bit more here, so many people, I think it's clear to me, want to end structural racism, but really don't want to change anything about the privileges that they have. They want to tweak the edges, but hold the middle. And it doesn't work like that. I think addressing this identity confusion between who we want to be and how much we are willing to give up is really the first step in building a new movement ecosystem and transforming unjust systems. So I always say that I read history to make sure that I don't go crazy, for I believe that the past can light a way out of the present darkness. We may not have been here, but we've been here before. White supremacy and the violence endured by Black people cannot be overcome unless we name it, face it, and work to lessen its impact. So where does all this history leave us today? Today, I believe we're at an inflection moment. History tells us that when things crumble, when things fall, when the house burns down, there is an opportunity in the rebuilding process. Do you ignore the lessons of history and build it the same, or do you build a whole new house? Right, that it's clear, I think, to so many of us that we have spent so much time bordering up holes on a sinking ship and holes on a leaking roof. The past 4 years, and especially the last year, have made clear, or the effective argument, that it's no longer working. In conclusion, I think we need to do a better job at reckoning with the past and repairing past harms and fighting for a new world rooted in the imaginative dreams of freedom fighters past and present. It is never lost on me that the political and legal institutions in this country are structured to overwhelm people, to make people feel powerless, and that the only change that is possible is a small amount of change. But as students of public policy, which I know that many of you are uniquely situated. You have connections, you have networks of privilege. You definitely know how to conduct landscape analyses. I have borne witness to this, right? So you have so many of the tools, and I believe that you have the power, and I'm so excited to watch the world that so many of you might help create in the future. I'll end there. I'm happy to take any questions about kind of the past history of the Black Lives Matter movement, thinking about some of what is going on today, as well as talking about kind of shifts in the movement over time.
Thank you, Megan. It's wonderful to be in the screen with you again. Thank you for joining us, especially for the the finale grandioso in this in our fall semester flagship series here in the Carr Center. So I'd like to start us off with a couple of questions about the present situation as in the election result, and then what this is leading to in terms of the incoming administration. So many of us had hoped, and quite a few of us had also thought, that the rebuttal handed to the Trump administration, to the Republican Party and this administration, especially also in terms of perceptions around its racial policies, would be way stronger than it was. So we ended up 74 million people voting for Trump, an astounding result by any historical standard. So my first question is really about that. Did that magnitude of positive turnout for Trump surprise you? Or probably it surprised you way less than it surprised many other people. So what do you make of that in also in the context of the political mobilization of this year? And then an immediate follow-up question to that is, now Joe Biden will take office. The Biden administration will start its work in January. So, obviously one could talk a long time about hopes here, but what are realistic hopes? So based on the often deflationary story that that you tell, what is a realistic hope of change under the Biden administration, also with this looming possibilities of Trump hanging around long? So how do you see the next 4 years?
Yeah, no, so these are great questions. So let's start off right in terms of what is probably on everybody's mind, which is this election, as well as the aftermath, and which does not appear to end. So I think I would have liked, right? I would have liked this large scale repudiation of Trump. I don't think, in part because of the work that I do, and so steeped in thinking about the role of racial violence, and for me, how that has been such a constant over time, that I actually did not think that there was, at the end of the day, going to be a large scale repudiation. I did think, and I felt pretty sure, and maybe it's because I could not have imagined teaching American politics, which I do every year. I could not have imagined teaching American politics under another Trump administration. However, I believe that that it would be close. That it wasn't going to be decided on November 3rd was also no surprise to me. But I do think that we need to think more and talk a bit about how that President Trump is the Republican presidential nominee with the most Republican votes in history of Republican presidential nominee, right? Over 70 million people saw what has been happening, saw the sexist and racist rhetoric, right? That's not these are actual facts, right? There's actual statements, and in terms of him saying different things about different groups of people, saw the disastrous response to the global health pandemic, right? And said, you know what, sign me up for this circus one more time, right? So like, and that is a lot of Americans. Many perhaps may have even come out for some of the BLM protests, right? That I think is kind of that mix, that polling, which we have not yet seen perhaps come out from some of my political science colleagues here. But I do think that this bespeaks, I think, and for me at least, and I think for many others, how entrenched in so many ways racism is in this country, and how much work still needs to be done, right? That even in like, so we should focus also on the tremendous, incredible support for the Biden-Harris ticket. Like that is also kind of this other part of the story and extraordinary. And yet at the same time, over 70 million Americans helped us, right, paint a more complete picture about who this country actually is and how much work must be done. And how in so many ways, kind of the ways that he speaks also resonates with an incredible number of people, I think is very clear. In terms of the Biden administration moving forward, especially as Trump looms, and he makes no promises to retreat. At the same time though, and here's the thing, it's like, one of the things that was clear, at least to me, is that kind of like this like center like position is not gonna move that much in terms of, isn't gonna win him, let's say, re-election. That like what he needs, and like what actually brought him victory, right, this year was incredible organizing in old and new swing states, right? That's actually what tipped him over, right? That actually like fueled kind of like this energy behind the Biden-Harris ticket. And that's what was key. And that's going to be also what's going to be key in 4 years. And so I think that like as he constructs this administration and what the agenda is going to be, it will be necessary to actually appeal, and to me at least, work with, bring in the fold organizers who have actually been doing work with people on the ground. Now, in terms of, let's say, I think that part of your question is also one about the criminal punishment system and how much and what perhaps a Biden administration can do around like what have we seen, at least from people, is like whether that is in terms of transformational, defund, and or reform. Like if it has been made clear, and I think that it is, not just to liberals and Democrats, but also to many conservatives, right? That the criminal punishment system, it uses up a lot of money. It's not the most justice system out here, that we need perhaps a new system. So it seems that actually people on both camps are kind of on board with that. But then it's like, okay, so then what does that actually look like? And it strikes me that already, right, what we're seeing here in terms from him is this, I think, this is mentioned in a talk that I gave earlier this week. I think he has a summit between, what is it, governors and police chiefs. And I think that I think the administration can do more than that. Can and should do more than summits. That like the one message, like the resounding message from protests this year is that reform is not enough. And that reform continues to get us back where we are, right? And that like, in terms of many people here, in terms of our like policymakers, if it has not been working, not just for a year, but for decades, then perhaps we shouldn't do the same thing. Perhaps we need a different type of system. And I think that like he should actually bring people on board, have an executive, through executive order, actually have a council that is focused on, let's say, perhaps a justice council, in which some people who are maybe like veterans of like, I don't know, like criminal procedure attorneys, individuals who have served time, as well as individuals who work with people who have been recently released and or previously incarcerated communities, like together and thinking about what are changes that need to actually be made. I think that would be, I think, an important show, and something that isn't, at least for him, totally out there yet, but could at least start to build a conversation, as well as the political education that needs to happen at the executive level, at the executive branch level around that.
Thank you so much, Megan, for your remarks and presentation. I'm going to pick up on Mathias's question. And recently, former President Obama had made a statement. I must say, I didn't watch the entire interview, but he said, you lose people with snappy slogans like defund the police. So I wanted to just zoom out and refer back to a conversation we had in the series with Michael Dawson, who you had actually referred to us from the University of Chicago, and he's done work on the neoliberal racial order and on Black political elites. And so I'm wondering, what is your take looking forward in 2021 at the role of social movements and organizers and grassroots groups to push African Americans in political office, as well as others, to just be more progressive? Where is that tension between sort of political leadership and social movement activism? Where are there points of convergence and divergence in the coming year?
Yeah, no, so that's an excellent question. I think it's been one of those things that's been really interesting about 2020, and that has come out, not just even within the movement for Black Lives and the many organizations that are a part of it, is the variances, right? In terms of, and how like Black people and Black political thought, it's not a monolith, right? That there's all these different ways that people see themselves, that understand their positionality, that understand different understandings, about how much they can push, as well as what they can get out of the political system. And so there's these kind of different frameworks, right, that sometimes clash, right? There are organizations, for example, like that are connected with the movement for Black Lives, that are some working for different types of reform, some that are more focused on abolition and defund, right? And many of these organizations are Black-led organizations. Now, when it comes to in terms of kind of like the political leadership class, whether those are individuals in Congress and or Black mayors of different cities here, which there, I think has been a big focus on, let's say, Black mayors, especially in the Democrat primary, right? A number of Black mayors who supported, for example, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, a number of Black mayors that supported, in my opinion, not surprisingly, and I know that this is an HKS webinar, but Michael Bloomberg, as well as Joe Biden, right? And it strikes, I mean, I tend to think that this variances and the different way that people are operating here, I think is actually useful and good. I do think that one of the things for me that's pretty exciting is, for a while it seemed that there was kind of this one model, the establishment Black political class. And what we're seeing, especially over the last few years, is a kind of a different political class, right? So I'm in Seattle, Washington. Nikita Oliver ran for mayor and got very close. And people are like, oh my goodness, how could Nikita Oliver, who's a Black Lives Matter activist, get so close to actually governing a city, right? And we're also seeing, I think, one of the celebrated cases we have right now is that of Cori Bush, right? Who was a protester, an organizer in Ferguson, right? Who is now in Congress, right? So I think that one of the things that's been really exciting, again, over the last 4 years, is there's no longer, in terms of kind of this model of what it means to be a Black political elite. You no longer have to go to the HKS Bloomberg program, right? As a type of kind of like way to get your credentials and be approved by the establishment, right? And in doing so, I think a number of people, like over time, and there's, I think, incredible studies from my colleagues in Black politics and urban politics who focus on this, but like the different compromises that a number of, like, let's say, Black mayors have made over time to like run cities, to get financial donations. And what you're seeing right now that's so exciting is that there are these progressive political candidates that are emerging from movements, right? And therefore, in terms of their accountability, isn't to a business class, it isn't to a class of donors, right? What we're seeing is that in this like new group of Black politicians, is that their accountability is actually towards community. And that's actually what they care about. And so I'm there as somebody who believes and like wants to see, in terms of not such a kind of a hard division between movement protest and so-called traditional and establishment politics. I am so excited right now about this bridge of like activists coming inside. Yes, please, and more. Is where I'll end on that.
Excellent, thank you. Let me pass on a question from the audience to you, Megan. So Ratna is asking, what advice do you have for student activists on making sure all this history is centered in all classes so that we can go into the world never failing to reckon with it? What's your educational advice for people out there?
Oh, that's such a good question. So first I want to amplify it. Yes. So I think that, I mean, as somebody who has come out, I taught last year at the Kennedy School, right, the Race and Equality and American Democracy class, as well as a course on philanthropy and social movements. And so I have a bit of kind of knowledge about how the Kennedy School works. I think that it's important to have these broader conversations about what are the historical dimensions and lineage and like of the present circumstances, ideas, policies, issues that you are talking about in class. That one of the things that always strikes me is how divorced like the issues are in some classrooms from the longer histories, right? And so, for example, let me just say that one of the things that I found really interesting in the present moment is that there's a lot of, for example, I've been in conversation with a lot of a number of funding entities and foundations who were caught off guard after the BLM protests after the spring and summer. And they're like, okay, how do I do better? And often this is a kind of a foundation question, but this is also, I think, in some ways a policy question, which is about how do we design effective policy, right? How do we become good policy makers? And so for the foundations, I'm always like, then the focus is always on the future and moving forwards. And that is crucial, but also that can't be done. That's going to encounter snags if we don't understand the historical precedents before that, right? And so the thing that I often tell foundations, for example, is yes, let's focus on the future, but also we need to understand the history about how we got to this moment, right? What are ways in which, for example, that foundations have been complicit in terms of like whether it's undercutting movements by funding grantees who are at cross purposes, and or how was wealth actually created? Now, it strikes me in a place like the Kennedy School about kind of like how can education actually address this is to always hold history, right? That we tend to think, oh, the history, that's just for a few professors who are actually focused on history. And it's like, no, that all of us can do better. That part of the problem, and that many people have made clear, if we don't come out of 2020 with anything, we should come out of 2020 and think about in terms of in order to heal, we need to tell full truth. I do not understand why that is so hard, right? In order to create and design good policy, in order to have better politics, we need to tell full truth. In order to tell full truth, we need to understand the past. And so that doesn't mean like, let's devote half the class to history, but that's something I think that we can acknowledge and we can learn so much from it. So that's something that I would say. I think in a place like the Kennedy School, I think that's also in terms of, I also want to like lift up and amplify the incredible work that the Equity Coalition has been doing and is currently doing, right? I think that that 2-week class around race and inequality that came out of a long-standing, many year Equity Coalition push. But more is needed, right? Because it's not just like these things, like it should be something that doesn't just happen at the beginning. It should be something that is threaded throughout.
So by way of following up on that, so my sense from Ratna's question actually was that was not meant to be limited to the Kennedy School. So maybe you can, so 2 follow-up questions actually. One, maybe you can also take that question as, what should activists out there do, just kind of broadly in the educational domain, not connected at all to the Kennedy School. But actually, I do also have a Kennedy School follow-up question for you, since you do know the Kennedy School so well. And one thing, I think that this election result has just made the general mission of the Kennedy School, being a public policy school, has made being a public policy school for any public policy school so much harder, right? Because on the one hand, I completely agree with you. We do need to talk about structural racism. We do need to talk about white supremacy. It's hard to make progress here without using this vocabulary. But one way of thinking about the election outcome with the 74 million is also, these are people who are also saying, we don't want to talk about white supremacy. We don't want to talk about structure. We don't want to talk about defunding the police. That's the law. And if you talk to people like from Ohio, right, that's what they would tell you. You can have these social justice conversations with people, but once you come with this vocabulary, they just shut down the conversation, which makes it hard to be a policy school, because on the one hand you want to follow your insight and say, yeah, that is the kind of that work needs to be done, but how do we do that while also still preparing people for let's say, ending up doing work in Ohio, working with people who are just kind of shutting down when it comes to conversations like that? You can take either one of these follow-up questions, and then I will turn back to Sushma.
Okay. So I'm going to address kind of the second part of the first of the question that I was already speaking about in terms of in terms of education. I do think in terms of that, it's not just, I hopefully that my comments that were kind of more focused on the Kennedy School can also be understood more broadly. That I don't think it's just kind of like the Kennedy School and or schools of public policy that need to do a better job at addressing the historical dimensions of contemporary issues, but I think that's all of us. I think that in terms of, what we see, I think reflected in whether it's K through 12 education, undergraduate and or graduate schools, is something, I think that there's a larger problem in the United States to have an honest reckoning with the past. Right. Instead, what we have is kind of like, and normally people learn kind of the short, compact history, right, of civil rights making in this country. And yet one of the things that is so very clear that comes out in 2020, as well as that came out around the protest around Charlottesville, is that statutes and icons are really important. We have mythology that exists in this country, right? And so one of the things that I think we need to do a much better job at is actually knowing the history of this country, right? That like part of what's led to the power behind, let's say, kind of the increasing rise of the white militia that we've seen, not just over this past year, but especially over the last 4 years, is in part because of a distorted history that continues to exist in so many places, not just the South, right? But all across the country. And so whether it is about the taking of land dispossession in terms of indigenous nations, whether that is about the enslavement and lynchings of Black people, but like, it strikes me that what we really need is a much deeper, in my opinion, like federal reparations, memory and monuments commission that does more work and helping us as a public in different communities understand our past history. That to me is really important. The other thing that I talk about actually a lot with educators, not like at the graduate level, but educators, is how to tell this fuller history, because it's really important. And one of the things that I always say, and I think that this is difficult for some though, but it's important, is to not, in terms of sunder racial violence, is how to actually talk about it. This is the work of the Equal Justice Initiative under the incredible Bryan Stevenson, right? That he's like, we're never gonna move where we need to do as a nation if we actually don't address lynchings and mob violence. And it's not just for college students, right? That is for younger kids. That's what like Black students, young Black children learn about all, and like that history is not just important to young Black children. That history is important to all of us. And that understanding that history, I think, will allow us to tell will help us to address the present. So I do think that public education is incredibly important to address this other issue in terms of the complications and the problems of a public policy school, to do that, especially after the election right now. I'm not sure if like, I'm not exactly sure if it is so tough. I think that like some of these issues perhaps are not as complicated as it might seem. I think that what we can do a lot is to like, I think sometimes it's like white supremacy, and then people are like, one, right? Some people are like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming, right? And then other people are like, just like you said, just tune out. Like, I don't want to be accosted by, like, talks about racism and white supremacy. But like, I think that one of the things is key, and this takes, I think, a certain level of dexterity and nimbleness and commitment, really from the top down, means to help to understand how what seemingly so many people in a place like the Kennedy School actually want to do, and the policies that they actually want to change are actually connected, right, to these deeper institutional structures that we like to think that like white supremacy and racism is over there. Oh, no, no, like it impacts everything. But I don't think that all of us perhaps have the nimbleness to be able to make these important connections. And so we think that we can talk about situations around citizenship, around housing, around international affairs, and not have a conversation about white supremacy. In my opinion, that's impossible, and that's negligence. But in other people, they think that they can actually do that. I think not, right? But I think that means in terms of a commitment to drawing those deep connections. And I think that there's ways that you can do it and not be, what's that called? Like, and so-called, this is the words that other people use, I don't know when here, but confrontational, right? There's ways that we can have these conversations and like how addressing issues such as white supremacy is actually useful for everyone. So that's all I'll say on that.
Well, that's a lot, and I don't think I could say anything other than amen. Keep on preaching. I support you. And I do think that a lot of the issues you raised around sort of creating a new public narrative, relying on history, thinking of public spaces and how to make them inclusive, thinking of educating the next generation, all children, it's really, really important. I also think looking internally at our own institutions is really important. And I completely agree. You can't really say we're working on health or human rights or education policy without really centering issues of race and historical discrimination and current day effects in the work. And it really isn't that complex. It's literally like taking a step forward and moving forward and being courageous and communicating one's convictions and values and creating a big tent to move the agenda forward. So we're really inspired and grateful to you, Megan, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Thanks.